Who imagined, during the long years of struggle against apartheid, that the gap between rich and poor in South Africa after liberation would widen? Whereas a year after the first democratic election, the wealthiest 20% of the population were taking in 70% of all income, 10 years later they were taking 80%. Of 134 nations compared by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency in 2010 for degree of income inequality among their citizenry, South Africa ranked second after neighboring Namibia. More recently, the United Nations Development Program ranked only Namibia, Haiti, and 5 other countries beyond South Africa in extent of income inequality. The Gini coefficient is the most commonly used measure of income inequality between countries and within segments of their populations. A Gini coefficient of 0 would represent complete equality, where every entity, person, or household receives an equal income. The opposite end of the scale is a Gini coefficient of 1, meaning complete inequality, when one person or entity gets all the income while the rest receive none. This table from a University of Cape Town study shows that income inequality grew after the first democratic election within every group. It didn't take long after the ANC replaced the Afrikaner nationalist government in power for the old poor white problem that the apartheid government had virtually eliminated to reappear in full force. Looking for work. Have 2 children. Donations appreciated. Please help. No longer was skilled and semi-skilled work in the private sector reserved for whites by law. No longer were black sweepers fired from government offices and black laborers from the state-owned railways, so that poor white farm boys, most of them Afrikaners, could be taken on instead. Now, the state's jobs help went the other way. While the average rise in unemployment for all population groups between 1998 and 2002 was 39%, white unemployment increased by 79%. Researchers estimated that 450,000 of the shrinking white population of 4.5 million were living below the poverty line in shanties and squatter camps around the cities. For whites, the change in their living conditions was not unexpected. It's politics, observed a woman who could no longer find employment and had lost her former house. For millions of blacks, however, it was the absence of change in their living conditions that was unexpected. 8 years after liberation, more than 21 million South Africans, then just under half the country's population, were living on less than $2 a day. When apartheid ended, there were 300 so-called informal settlements around the country. 16 years later, there were 2,639 of these squatter settlements, places where people strove to keep their bodies and clothes clean, where filling their plastic water buckets was handled from the side to avoid stepping into the overflow from shared toilets. Here on Election Day 2009 in the Deep Sloot settlement between Johannesburg and Pretoria, prospective voters, including an enterprising produce vendor, negotiated rivulets of excrement as they headed to a polling station. Bad as the residence conditions were, the Minister of Human Settlements told members of Parliament in 2010, They had run away from conditions in the rural areas that were worse. They are refugees, he said. From the time the first democratically elected government took office in 1994, the problems were daunting. The country then was close to bankruptcy. Only 3 weeks of foreign exchange reserves were left in the kitty. Billions of dollars in debt had been rung up in apartheid's last days by the old regime's Bantustan proteges. The central government itself had financed its long efforts to remain in power by borrowing heavily from the Public Employees Pension Fund, leaving a gaping hole in the fund for the black government to fill. The indebtedness of the new government and the pressures to spend on immediate poverty relief were such that Moody's Investment Service, one of the 2 major firms that judge the ability of corporations and governments to pay back what they owe, awarded South Africa a rating just above sub-investment or junk bond status. This rating meant higher interest charges for the additional borrowing the new government had to undertake to meet interest payments on the apartheid debt. Besides paying down the debt, another expense impossible to postpone was ending racially discriminatory spending in education, welfare, pensions, and health. How could the new government continue paying black, colored, and Asian nurses less than white nurses in the public hospitals? But then how also to find the money to provide public housing, clean water, sanitation to the millions without? For 2 years following liberation, the ANC's leaders, many Moscow-trained, and all allied with the South African Communist Party, cast about, unable to agree on the way forward, whether to jack up tax rates on high-income earners, whether to raise tariff barriers to protect the memberships of the allied union federations, but aware that immediate poverty relief was expected. The government pledged that everyone would have decent, well-located, and affordable shelter by 2003. Mandela personally promised free health care for mothers and children, free meals for 4 million poor school children. But these remained promises. Meanwhile, the departure from the country of human capital in the form of skilled professional and managerial personnel accelerated, while foreign direct investment entered at a trickle. To pay its bills without raising taxes, which would have only exacerbated the brain drain, the government increased the money supply. The result was that in February 1996, the rand's value fell by more than a quarter, threatening particularly the poor with unmanageable price rises. Deputy President Mbeki, then effectively running the government, changed policy course quickly. Now, spending would be cut. This would free up funds to pay off the national debt at a faster pace, resulting in lowered interest charges. The savings would enable inflation to be brought down, encouraging lenders to extend more credit. Hopefully, this would then facilitate investment and boost employment. Equity in state-owned enterprises would be sold. Some state enterprises would be sold outright. Tariffs would be lowered. Labor regulations eased. To implement this program, or as much of it as the Union and Communist allies of the ANC would permit, Trevor Manuel, a former street activist whose mother was a garment worker, a man with no formal training in economics, was appointed Minister of Finance, the counterpart of a U.S. Treasury Secretary. 2 years earlier, Mandela, wanting to appoint a Minister of Trade and Industry as the first democratic government was being formed, asked around the table who was a good economist. Manuel, reportedly mishearing Mandela's question as who was a good communist, raised his hand. For 13 years, spanning the terms of the country's first 3 presidents, Manuel drew up the annual budgets and helped formulate economic policy. Between liberation and the year 2005, the national debt was reduced by nearly a half. Thus, the amount the government had to pay out in interest charges was significantly reduced, while double-digit inflation ended. Not only did this free up revenue for poverty relief, the entire tax structure and tax collection operation were reorganized to generate more revenue without raising tax rates. To lead this effort, Manuel appointed Pravin Gordhan, a qualified pharmacist and a former communist and operative in the ANC underground, as head of the South African Revenue Service. The Revenue Service was set up by Mbeki and Manuel to be a semi-autonomous agency which, singularly, would not be obliged to follow affirmative action in its hiring, nor would it have to adhere to government pay scales. Poor compliance and lax enforcement had been characteristic of the apartheid-era's Directorate of Internal Revenue. No longer. Teams of inspectors were dispatched by Gordhan to study industries suspected of tax evasion. Although Mbeki and Manuel reduced corporate tax rates from 35 to 28% over 10 years, Gordhan's accountants were able to boost corporate tax collections by an average of 20% each year, a figure taking into account increases in corporate profits. Personal income tax rates were also lowered, and collections rose, though by a smaller percentage. Here, tax payment day in Port Elizabeth in 2009. More was also collected from the value-added tax. This tax had replaced the sales tax in 1991. It was levied on manufacturers, so was harder to evade than sales tax by customers ordering online. However, some South African businesses had taken advantage of 2 circumstances to evade the tax. One, on goods that had been exported after the value-added tax had been paid, the manufacturer was entitled to reimbursement. 2, the section of the old Directorate of Internal Revenue which collected the tax did not communicate with the section administering reimbursements. Trucks would arrive at a border post, as here, get stamped through, turn around while still fully packed, then claim tax reimbursement. One company obtained stamped-through documents to support a claim of having exported 78 million bras to Lesotho, a country with a population then of 2 million, less than half of whom, of course, wore bras. Gordhan commented, "The bra, it seems, has replaced the blanket as Lesotho's national dress." The company paid millions in back taxes and penalties. During Gordhan's 10 years at the helm as tax collector, revenue tripled. Thabo Mbeki's decision to focus first on paying down the debt, resulting in interest payments diminishing from 20% of the budget in 1996 to 8% 12 years later, together with the huge boost provided by the work of the Revenue Service, gave Manuel financial space to budget billions of rand to poverty relief. Poor children, among whom were an ever-increasing number orphaned by the HIV/AIDS pandemic, were given support by direct grants to mothers and foster mothers. Government pensions and grants were issued to the old and to the disabled. By 2009, more than a quarter of all households were receiving some form of direct government assistance, as well as indirect assistance in the form of free health care for children, pensioners, and the unemployed. 2.5 million cheaply built government-subsidized houses were erected between 1994 and 2007. The poorest families, selected from an expanding list of applicants, received a 100% subsidy towards the price of a house. The less indigent qualified for reduced subsidies. The houses were small, so small, people joked, you need to go outside to change your mind. But they were fully serviced. The first 50 kiloliters of water provided free, plus sufficient kilowatts of electricity for lighting. However, after a few years, cracked walls, windows stuck open or stuck shut, leaking roofs, inoperative toilets made it necessary to flatten tens of thousands of them. There was no catching up, as seen here, an informal settlement on the edge of a government housing project. Shacks began to appear even in Johannesburg's central business district. To leave the residents of the multiplying squatter camps without access to clean water, sanitation, and rubbish removal would threaten the health of the general population. Sums were allocated for fixes. Whether such fixes would be temporary or permanent, who could say? Some of the millions left behind continued to hope, like some of these people, lining up in 2009 to vote. As young children, they had seen children being shot dead by the apartheid police for protesting a government order that half of their school subjects be taught in Afrikaans, a language they nor their teachers spoke. Despite everything, now was a better time. Others, though, had lost hope, especially the unemployed. Whether only the work-seeking unemployed were counted as unemployed, or whether added to this number were those who had given up looking for work, both ways, there were more than double the number of unemployed in South Africa in 2007 as there had been in 1994 at liberation. Yet the population had not doubled. It had grown by only a fifth. Real per capita income of black household heads alone among all racial groups had declined during this period, according to this University of Cape Town study. Since household income had risen for the black beneficiaries of the affirmative action and black economic empowerment policies, this means that income had dropped more than 1.78% in black households whose heads were not beneficiaries of these programs. For many among the millions left behind, the hope of one day getting out of their shacks receded. Archbishop Tutu's criticism of the government for spending billions of rands to buy weapons was discussed, and the fact that nothing seemed to have come of it. They heard of the far better fortune of others, placed in jobs with the government's help, now able to live in proper houses, on paved streets with regular refuse collection. Some shack dwellers, glad to be earners, commuted daily to new black-owned homes to look after the masters' and mistresses' children, to wash garments and bedding, to dust, wax the floors, prepare the meals. Some brought back newspapers that had been discarded. News spread of black men and black women who were now owners of gold and platinum mines. There were pictures of the Maponya Mall in Soweto, owned by a black property developer. There was a story about a lobbyist for white businesses who helped solve their problems with the government, with a picture of him eating sushi at what was billed as the mother of all parties. Many of the newly prosperous were proud to provide their dependents and themselves with quality clothes and jewelry and top-of-the-line cars. Their associates and the public at large were invited to see these accoutrements as reflections of their worth. Such displays are common throughout the living world, human and non-human. But the context in which wealth displays occur in South Africa is singular. No other country combines multi-party democratic institutions and a free press with both widespread deep poverty and close to the highest degree of income inequality in the world. The CIA study mentioned earlier ranks South Africa as the state with the second highest degree of income inequality among 134 countries, which includes the United States, ranked 41st highest, followed by 93 states with less income inequality. South Africa is a member of the G20, the world's 19 leading economies, plus the European Union. India, another G20 member, also has deep and widespread poverty, and also has a free press. But according to measures conducted by both the UN and the CIA, India has far less inequality of income. Trevor Manuel, South Africa's long-serving finance minister, noted that while top civil servants in India had graduated from bicycles to small family cars, even middle-rank civil servants in South Africa were driving high-end German cars. Brazil also is a member of the G20. Brazil once matched South Africa in extent of inequality, but inequality has been diminishing in Brazil since the mid-1990s, at the same time increasing in South Africa. While the divide between rich and poor kept growing wider, the opposition press drew the public's attention to the incongruity between the egalitarian pronouncements of leading figures in the governing party and their behavior. After it was reported that Blade Nzimande, Secretary General of the South African Communist Party, appointed Minister of Higher Education in 2009, had obtained a $157,000 BMW, he declared, "I have not abandoned my values. I don't think I've abandoned my moral leadership. I'm still a communist. I'm still committed to the working class." Indeed, South Africa's new leaders, like those of the old regime, seemed at ease, conferring extravagant benefits on themselves at the state's expense, such as having the South African Air Force fly Deputy Prime Minister Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka with her family on a private shopping expedition to Abu Dhabi, and later on, chartering a plane to fly more than 5,000 miles down from Switzerland to pick her up in South Africa and transport her to attend meetings in Europe, thereby costing her government 4.5 million rands more than the cost of a direct charter from South Africa. Her successor as Deputy Prime Minister, Baleka Mbete, in 2006, prior to her promotion from Speaker of the National Assembly, chartered a private jet at a cost of 471,900 rand, approximately $60,000, paid by the Treasury to fly her and one member of her staff to attend a ceremony in Liberia to which then-President Mbeki was also flying. He in his presidential jet, his foreign minister in a commercial flight. No laws were broken, but the message was clear. When certain members of Parliament were convicted of breaking the law, it was seen that they remained in Parliament to make new laws. Beginning in 2004, 135 of the 400-member Parliament were investigated for falsifying their government-supplied travel vouchers. According to the Secretary to Parliament, Singili Dingani, 89 were found to have submitted false mileage claims or used their vouchers to finance vacation travel for themselves and relatives. Some had converted vouchers into cash with the help of law-breaking travel agents. Most, including the ANC parliamentary whip and the Home Affairs Minister, stayed out of court by repaying 5 million rand obtained fraudulently. 10 went to court. All 10 were convicted of fraud, fined, and issued prison sentences, which were then suspended. Subsequently, 8 of the 10 were again placed by party leaders high enough up on the ANC's 2009 election list to guarantee their return to Parliament as members. 2 were put on the ANC's list to be seated in provincial legislatures. 12 million rand of the 17 million rand illegally claimed were never recovered. As in the previous apartheid regime, corruption by public officials in South Africa extends upward and downward from the level of members of Parliament. A technicality enabled the fourth ANC president, Jacob Zuma, to escape prosecution for taking bribes, although the payer of the bribes was convicted and briefly imprisoned. More on this later. Also not prosecuted was a former defense minister, implicated in massive corruption stemming from the multi-billion-dollar arms deals. This has already been mentioned, as has the unsuccessful effort of the country's second ANC president to obstruct prosecution of his national police chief, who was eventually found guilty of having been in business with a mafioso gangster, from the national down to the provincial and the local. The impoverished Eastern Cape province was found to have thousands of ghost employees, each on salary or collecting a pension. As a result, 79% of the province's budget over an 8-year period could not be accounted for, and so on and so forth. But the use of public office for personal gain is not more prevalent in South Africa than elsewhere. The most commonly used corruption measure for countries worldwide is the annual Corruption Perception Index, published by Transparency International. The 2010 index ranked the United States as less corrupt than South Africa. This despite top-down corruption in the U.S. Congress, whose members leave office wealthier than when they enter. In part, this was the result of engaging in illegal stock trading based on inside, non-public information they are privy to. Insider trading has brought private investors lengthy prison sentences, but no members of the U.S. Congress have been prosecuted for this. The U.S. also maintains a system of legal corruption. In the words of New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, quote, Supreme Court-sanctioned bribery in the form of campaign donations that have enabled the financial services industry to effectively buy the U.S. Congress and both political parties. Unquote. Be that as it may, Transparency International's 2010 Corruption Perception Index ranked half the leading economies represented in the G20 as more corrupt than South Africa. But while corruption by public officials is not more prevalent in South Africa than elsewhere, it occurs in the context of an unemployment rate much higher than that of all other members of the G20. Indeed, the highest out of 61 nations tracked by Bloomberg News Agency. And in the context that those employed, 44% of them live on less than 10 Rand a day, according to a United Nations Development Program report. 10 Rand buys a loaf of bread costing 7 Rand 30 cents, with 2 Rand 70 cents left over. A study completed in 2002 found that the South African population had developed into 3 identifiable groups, consisting of about 15 million persons each. The first group, composed in 2002 of about 4 million white and 11 million blacks, coloreds, Indians, and others, received 88% of total income. A second group of 15 million, consisting mainly of blacks, received about 8% of total income. The third group of 15 million people, also mainly black, received 4% of the national income. In 2009, 7 years after this study was done, nearly 18 million people voted in the country's 4th democratic election, meaning 2 out of every 3 people eligible to vote voted. It's a fair guess that almost all blacks, whites, and other adults belong to the 1/3 minority that received nearly 90% of the national income voted. Also casting ballots were men and women who lived in straitened circumstances, yet recognized that government action had made a difference in their lives. They had not forgotten the humiliation and brutality brought upon them by the agents of apartheid. Some had jobs. They felt pride in being able to contribute to the well-being of their children, their spouses, their aged parents. Some, for the first time, slept under roofs that didn't leak, had indoor water with which to wash and cook, also indoor sanitation and electricity. No doubt some voters were unemployed, lived in shacks, shared outdoor sanitation with many neighbors, but were not dismissive about the $35 a month in child support per child they received from the government, or the monthly old age pension of $146, or the allowance for caring for foster children. Not much money, but it was keeping them alive. Yet, 12 million people, more than 1 in 3 of those eligible to vote, didn't vote. It's a safe bet that these were the millions who, after 15 years of democracy, were left to divide 4% of the country's income. Left to divide 4% of the country's income is an abstraction, shading less abstract realities. Caring for a sick child when there are long queues for the tap. Sharing 6 toilets with 6,000 people. Trying to raise one's kids amidst the epidemic of rape afflicting most especially terrified little girls in the multiplying informal settlements. Riddled as these settlements are with AIDS, and not the state's top priority for police protection. Shack dwellers in Durban demonstrably refused to cast ballots. They agreed not to celebrate Freedom Day, the national holiday on April 27th, the anniversary of the country's first democratic election. Instead, to mark this date as Unfreedom Day and observe it as a day of mourning. The Abalali Base Mujondolo, the shack dwellers movement, so began. The spark came after residents of the Kennedy Road informal settlement, which bordered Durban's municipal garbage dump, left what they believed had been a successful meeting with city housing officials and their own ward councillor. According to shack dwellers who attended, the municipal officials promised to provide housing for their community on a piece of vacant public land. Just 1 month later, the municipality, without informing them, sold the land to a private developer. When residents of the slum learned that bulldozers were preparing the land for a brick factory, they blocked the site's access road. The developer and the local councillor, whom the shack dwellers had formally supported with their votes, called in the police. People were beaten and bitten by police dogs. There were arrests. It was in the wake of this experience that the shack dwellers movement, Abalali Base Mujondolo, was born. Its elected chairperson, Sabu Zikodi, had been raised by a single mother, a domestic servant. He had pursued a formal education, but had to abort it after reaching university level, when he could no longer pay both the school fees and his rent. He then moved into the Kennedy Road shack settlement and worked at a nearby gas station as a pump attendant. Within 5 years, the movement he worked to organize had spread to 64 other shack settlements in Durban and in other cities. Zikodi gave clear and public voice to what his neighbors thought. "Voting for parties has not brought any change to us," he said. Nor had petitioning the authorities. Quote, "We discovered that our municipality does not listen to us when we speak to them in Zulu. We tried English. Now we realize that they won't understand Xhosa or Sotho either. The only language that they understand is when we put thousands of people on the street." The most critical aim of the shack dwellers, more critical than trying to obtain services for their shacks, was to stop their municipality engaging in what municipalities throughout South Africa regarded as slum clearance. Bad as it was living with rats crawling over babies and plastic bags for toilets, demolition of their shacks was worse. It meant homelessness, or, as had happened also under the old apartheid regime, relocation to hastily erected structures in rural areas, far from access to employment, schools, and hospitals. Thus, relocation to hopelessness. An example was Blikkiesdorp, the tin town. Although water and toilet facilities shared between residents of every 4 corrugated one-room structures was an improvement, the fact that the settlement was 18 miles from Cape Town cast a pall over the residents. Throughout South Africa, municipalities, those controlled by the African National Congress and those controlled by its main opposition, the Democratic Alliance, the DA, were demolishing illegal shack settlements erected on unoccupied private and public land. The aims were to protect property values for private owners and to enable cities to raise revenue through the sale of public land. Also, removing informal settlements, especially from the cities, lessened the chance that the magnitude of desperation and inequality in the country would be exposed to foreign visitors, some who might be contemplating investment, as well as tourists coming for the game reserves and the World Cup. To propel evictions forward, KwaZulu-Natal's provincial legislature in 2007 enacted the Elimination and Prevention of Reemergence of Slums Act. The Slums Act, as it was known, required municipalities and private landowners to evict all illegal shack dwellers by a date certain. Any shack dweller who resisted removal, or reoccupied a cleared site, or held a protest rally on it, would be subject upon conviction to 5 years imprisonment and a $2,280 fine. The Slums Act was meant to be replicated in all other South African provinces. Now facing not just the loss of a promised piece of land with legal tenure and housing, but of actual expulsion from Durban itself, Zikoni, who had once hoped to complete a law degree, led Abalali Basemujondolo to challenge the new law in Durban High Court. But Judge President Vuka Chabalala upheld the law. The province of KwaZulu-Natal must be applauded for attempting to deal with the problem of slums and slum conditions, he wrote. This is the first province to have adopted legislation such as the Slums Act. The Slums Act makes things more orderly in this province. On the heels of this decision, the head of the province's Department of Human Settlements predicted, quote, the eradication of all slum settlements in KwaZulu-Natal by 2014. But the residents of Kennedy Road appealed Judge Chabalala's ruling in the Constitutional Court, the country's highest court. Here, judges found that the Slums Act would have allowed for mass evictions without the possibility of a suitable alternative, and thus violated the section of South Africa's Constitution which guarantees all citizens access to adequate housing. It was a defensive victory for the shack dwellers movement, added to some actual advances. After months of street action, Zikoni, who had been arrested with his deputy and, he said, tortured by a police superintendent, announced a deal with Durban, which would see services being provided to 14 settlements, and tenure security and formal housing to 3. But this deal came with more costs. In September 2009, Kennedy Road was attacked by a mob reportedly affiliated with the African National Congress. Violence continued over a weekend, without intervention by police. 2 people were killed and 30 dwellings burned out, including Zikoni's. He and his family fled. He had become, as he saw it, a political refugee. In Cape Town, with 340,000 applicants for public housing on the city's housing database, and about 40,000 new migrants moving to the city annually, the problem was as insoluble as in Durban. In Durban, the people in charge of the municipality were mostly black and Indian. In Cape Town, mostly white and colored. This difference didn't matter. Since 1994, the separator in South Africa was class, not race. Those who had obtained or inherited advantages saw an interest in providing some relief, like child support payments, to those who had next to nothing. But they were not willing to accept sky-high taxes to provide, in effect, free housing to millions in the multiplying informal settlements. Nor would they agree to pay the electricity and water bills and house payments of individuals who had lost jobs. How long could those better off remain secure in their property rights if land occupations by the poor were to continue unimpeded? In 2008, Cape Town established a special police anti-land invasions unit. Even if illegal occupiers only took over vacant acreages, it was anticipated that demands would soon follow requiring additional taxes from those with the means to pay them. And so, announcing that the city's anti-land invasion unit had demolished one more shack settlement on a piece of vacant state-owned land, Cape Town's mayor explained, if the group were allowed to squat there, they would start shouting for services, such as electricity and toilets. After demolition, a mother of three had a different take. We have no place to stay. The government has millions to spend on building stadiums for the World Cup, but I have been waiting for a house for the past 20 years. Inequality would not diminish after liberation from apartheid, but would increase. This was unexpected. Also unexpected was that a terrible plague would spread throughout the country.
Nina